So we are in time period 2 again, which is, what are our dates for time period 2?
1415 to 1750.
Very good. 1450 to 1750. We're in topic 4.3, the Columbian Exchange. This is something we should all know. It's pretty basic. You've talked about it before in previous years as students. Can someone broadly define for me the concept of the Columbian Exchange? How would you characterize that particular concept?
Wouldn't it be like the trade between, like the trade of food between like the Americas kind of and the rest of the world?
A little more specific than that, but yes, and a little more broad in some ways. It's the Americas and Afro-Eurasia. So rest of the world, kind of, but not like Pacific Islands,
Okay.
or Antarctica. Or, I mean, I'm being silly, but that's also part of it. So things that were not in Europe or Asia or Africa that come over from the Americas, like tomatoes. When we think of Italian cuisine, we think of tomato sauce. They did not have tomatoes till 500 years ago. And then the opposite is also true. Things like corn and potatoes coming from the Americas over to Europe. But then we also have, of course, animals. It's also disease. Smallpox, of course, is the best example. So it's not just trade, it's involuntary as well. Things that didn't quite even know it was happening. But it's the adding of the American continents into the global system, if you want to put it that way. All right. And there are some pretty negative effects. For example, the death of 90% of Native American populations, fairly bad, which therefore, in their mind, necessitates a need for increased labor, which leads to the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, which is one of the great horrors of the modern world. We also, of course, have effects in Afro-Eurasia of increased nutrition, because as we talked before, corn and potatoes have higher caloric values than things like wheat or other traditional grains. So without them knowing the science behind it, they're able to better feed their citizens, especially the poor, with these new food crops like corn and potatoes. All right. So that's the broad strokes of that. That has been a topic of AP essays before, the changes that take place because of that. Yeah. So it's a broad thing. Anybody have any questions about that? Do we kind of understand what we're talking about? We did an activity in class where we guessed where things came from. Again, you don't need that level of specificity, but like knowing corn or potatoes or smallpox is probably a good thing. That could definitely be some outside evidence if our DBQ is about a topic such as the interaction between societies, increased globalization, which I think is certainly one of the 3 or 4 topics I could see the essay being about, which is something I'll also talk about tomorrow, plug for tomorrow's overview. Topic 4.4, maritime empires established. We use the word maritime, meaning what?
Across the ocean.
Yeah, across the,
right?
Yeah, the mare refers to water, so in Latin. So that's where that comes from. Like some of the areas of the moon are called the mare, which, Latin is the source of that, even though there's no water, of course. So we establish these maritime empires, which means they're not connected, they're not contiguous, they're not our neighbors. We're crossing large bodies of water to establish colonies elsewhere. We're spreading our religion. We are trying to extract their colonies, just trying to extract their resources as colonies. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. We're going to see larger empires in Africa as we establish the slave trade. It becomes a very lucrative business to be involved in. We know the Europeans generally do not go into Africa and try to acquire slaves. They use allies in Africa to conquer their rivals and then sell those folks into slavery to the Europeans, who then, those native leaders who do so, then receive guns or other weapons, other trade goods to improve their empire status. And so we go from a small, not a whole lot of big empires in sub-Saharan Africa before 1450 to by 1750, we have huge empires along the coast because slave trading is such a lucrative business. The vast majority of people either end up as becoming slaves themselves, victims of that process, or benefiting from it economically and becoming larger and more powerful. We know many European states establish empires, the big ones like Britain and France, but even smaller nations like Portugal gets an empire, of course, in Asia or Brazil. We have the Spanish, we also have the Dutch. So it's a lot of us are getting involved in establishing empires elsewhere because of our new technology and because we make a lot of money off of it. So it helps facilitate the growing of empire and also the greed of getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Those are things that we tend to do. All right. Now, some states become isolationist during this time period. Not everyone's going to want to participate. Can anyone think of a place that's decidedly against global interaction during time period 2? They do not want to do this.
China.
China and Japan both are good examples. That's correct. Japan especially shuts down to almost everybody. The Chinese will regrettably do it. They'll, okay, fine, sure, but they complain about it. But they have so many trade goods that are highly desired, the money's too good not to. Of course, that money is often in time period 2 in the form of silver, which we know has some negative consequences for Chinese government, such as massive inflation, riots because we can't afford to pay our basic bills as the value of silver goes down since it becomes our currency. But Japan, interestingly enough, basically closes to the outside world, except for some Asian trading partners. Europeans are not allowed in. Christians are kicked out. Japanese people that have converted to Christianity are forced to at least publicly deconvert. We collect any Western goods that might have been traded into the country, like clocks or guns, and confiscate them. And we basically shut down our doors and will remain that way until 1853. So almost 250 years of isolation from most of the rest of the world, which is pretty remarkable in a time noted for massively increasing globalization. All right. Any questions about that? That should all kind of vaguely ring bells for you. Good. All right. We move on to the back of 4.4, so page 84 if you're following along on the study guide. The Europeans don't completely dominate everything yet. They're getting increasingly important, especially in Asia, but they are not dominant yet. That is period 3. I always like to remind you, period 2, Western European states will dominate in the Americas, but not yet in Asia or Africa at this point. Africa because generally not an interest yet, and Asia because the Asian societies are stronger and more dominant than they are. That's going to change by the end and definitely in period 3. But not yet. The example I gave you in class was like watching, a 6th grade LeBron James play basketball or Beyonce in her 3rd grade talent show. Be awesome. I'm sure she was great, but not to the level of either older kids or definitely not at the level of adult performers who are probably a third as talented as she is, but they just have more experience and more, comfort with performing, which is something you gain from that experience. So that's definitely what we have. The slave trade is called chattel. It's in your study guide. If you don't remember that, that's okay. Chattel indicates property with a soul. So these people can be traded. They can be, families can be broken up, but because they have a soul, we can convert them to our religion. So that allows us to, in theory, civilize them. That slavery has a benefit, that we're actually helping these folks. If we didn't enslave them, they'd still be running around worshiping their pagan god somewhere. And so we're actually helping them have a better life, which of course is complete foolishness, but that's the logic that is at least played out at that time period. And I know a lot of us go, Mr. Rich, they can't be that stupid. Yeah. The human mind is capable of cognitive dissonance. In other words, something is true, but you just avoid it. We all do that. I talked to my seniors yesterday. It was the first time I saw them since we officially announced that school was going to be out the rest of the year. And they all knew. They knew, but there's still that part of you that hopes that they would be able to do some of their traditions and things. And so they were sad, and I'm sad for them, and I get it. It sucks. But some of them had said kind of like, yeah, I thought we might be able to. And looking at it, they just knew, but you hold out that part of your brain, and that's just human nature. It is, that person that your friend that does dumb things, that they're going to get on the right track and they're going to stop doing whatever it is that's dumb. And you hope that's true, but at some point, that's kind of who they are. That I'll change them. I'll get them to do these. It's hard to change other people. You can change yourself, but that's hard. Changing other people is even more hard. So, basically it's this, we lie to ourselves that we're helping these people, we're giving them Christianity, and that makes it okay, which is not true, but that's at least what they think. We also talk about, we know we're going to have massive labor systems, these huge plantations in the New World. In the Spanish territories we call them haciendas, but these huge giant farms whose sole purpose is to do what? Why do they exist?
To work.
To work, but to produce what?
Cash crops.
Cash crops. Very good, Hayden. So anything that's not to provide sustenance, it's not to help us live, it's to help people make profit. So things like sugar, silver mining in North America, as you're famously aware of, cotton, tobacco, etc. But the number one cash crop by far is sugar. Remember, we had this conversation. What you learned in 8th grade about U.S. history and slavery is not wrong. I'm sure your teacher did a great job. But remember, the United States is an outlier compared to the other colonies in the Americas. They have different patterns, they have different weather, they have different goals, they have different colonizers. So the structures are different. You'll remember that next year when you get an APWH and you'll start talking about slavery and be like, oh, this is different. It is, because the United States is different. It just is. Only about 4% of the slaves from Africa end up in the United States. So it is a tiny part of an overall larger pattern that we see, okay? So it's like any other trade product. It's hard to think of humans as trade products, but in this case, that's what they are. As slavery helps produce more crops, as we get more and more out of our farms, that increases demand. So, ooh, I need to get some slaves as well, is the logic. And so we start to see the growth of people wanting slaves, not needing them. I think sometimes we say the word need. Let's be very careful there. They didn't need slaves. They wanted them. And they like the fact that they're making massive amounts of money without having to pay workers' salaries. One of the things that helps make Western Europe increasingly powerful in time period 2 is the massive growth of their economies. Their economies grow massively because they are not paying for workers' wages in colonies, and the fact that colonies are forced to sell to their colonial masters and to no one else. So therefore they are paying very little for these products. If you're a business owner and not paying for supplies and not paying much for workers, you're massively increasing your profits. Does anyone remember what this economic system is called?
Is it mercantilism?
It is mercantilism. That is correct. So mercantilism is definitely immoral. Definitely, encourages some shady things we just talked about, but it absolutely allows Western European states to increase their power, their wealth, their military outreach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do Western European states become dominant world powers without it? There's no way to know. Definitely if they did, it would have been a lot slower process. There's no doubt about that. Mercantilist wealth definitely speeds up the ability to build a bigger military, to support technological innovation. A lot of these governments in Europe basically have like grants where they are giving money to scientists to invent things if it helps the society. So if you know you're going to get paid, you're more likely to engage in a task. And that's true today. It was true for most of human history. We all like to be rewarded for our work, and or sometimes it's a necessity. Like if I say I'd work for free, that's a lovely sentiment, but that means I'm rich enough that I don't need a salary, which most of us don't live that way. We don't have that fortune. We have to be able to pay our bills and things like that, especially in times like right now. We understand that the challenges of that. So slavery is going to be a huge part of the global economy. Slavery still continues in other places, in other ways. Slavery is as old as human history. We've always done this to each other. Traditionally, it's you lose a military conflict, you are enslaved. The great benefit for the African societies is, in addition to the trade goods they receive, their enemies are going to be sent away and they're never coming back. So I never have to look over my shoulder to look at a rebellion or an attempt to conquer the people that conquered you. They're gone and they're never coming back. So that's a benefit for many of these empires that become large during the slave trade process. All right, everybody good with that? Again, that's stuff that you've learned for years and years and years and years as students. You understand the broad strokes of it. It's just to make sure that you remember what time period it goes in. All right. The next page, 4.5, Maritime Empires that Maintain and Develop, page 85. It mentions the word mercantilist, so we already talked about that. So there you go on there. Sometimes I get going and I get a little ahead of myself. I know, shocking. But we also have what they mentioned, the concept, which I don't know if it will come up, so I'll at least mention it, called joint stock companies. The governments, as we mentioned earlier this week, fund early exploration missions. Ferdinand and Isabella famously of Spain supporting an Italian Columbus to go explore. But eventually, when we see great success in government-funded missions, we will start to see private citizens pool their resources and create companies that engage in this kind of trade. They're called joint stock companies because you own stock like you do today in the stock market. If your company has success financially, you receive more benefit. If you don't, if it doesn't, then you lose your money as well. So it's a risk. It's a gamble, absolutely. And then joint because they put their money in together and collectively people own this particular endeavor. And the biggest companies in the world in time period 2 are going to be those that engage in this kind of behavior, specifically the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, who basically go to Asia, load up with goodies the Europeans don't have, and sail them back. and make massive amounts of money doing so. A lot of spices, etc., things like that. Okay, next page, 86. This is a good example of how sometimes they phrase things. It says here, the Atlantic trading system. That's one of those things, if you're nervous on AP testing, like Atlantic trading system. Atlantic is a capital A in your study guide. That just means the Atlantic Ocean. So they love doing that with bodies of water, the Mediterranean world, the Indian world. They don't say Indian world usually because that would refer to India, because there's also an ocean, but there's the continent, the subcontinent, and the continent, and the nation of India. But they use that, like the Pacific world. That just means places that touch the Pacific Ocean. So I think all of us know the exam's very different. I think there's going to be, even with that, there's going to be some anxiety and nervousness that day. It's important to take a deep breath and realize there's nothing they're going to ask you to write about that you don't know. No matter what the question is, you have studied something about it. You have discussed it with me. We have done an activity about it or reviewed it or whatever, and I'm going to put up your reviews that you guys turned in last week over the next couple of days, and I'll have a Google Drive where if you want to, you can go through and access your classmates' research into that if there's something that you feel like you need to learn more about. Most of the reviews I've seen so far, I'd say like 95% are pretty good. A couple of them had to modify and add a few things to, or take a few things away, like, oh, that's wrong. But for the most part, y'all did a really good job. And so you don't need to look at all of them, because for probably 80% of this material, you look at it and go, oh yeah, I remember that. It's the 20% you may need some refreshing on, and you click on that link and it can take you there. And in 5 minutes, you get what you need, and then you move on. So that's kind of where we need to be at this point. Yeah, so that, I mean, it talks about all sorts of things on that page. It mentions that the vast majority of people are still doing peasant labor. They're still farming. This is a pre-industrial era, so we don't have manufacturing centers yet. And it mentions that in addition to literally moving people around, we also move around their culture. So we see, as we have the African diaspora, as you may remember the term, the forced removal of people from their homeland, millions and millions of folks brought against their will over a 300-year period to the Americas. They also bring aspects of their culture. We see mixing as slave masters try to make people become their religion. They might do some of that and hold on to some of their traditions. We talk specifically about the religion officially called Vodun, V-O-D-U-N, better known to many of us as voodoo, which is a mixture of West African animism, like spirits in the world and all that, combined with their master's attempt to make them become Catholic. So it's a Catholic animism mixture, which is kind of odd to many of us because those seem pretty different. And so it's a pretty unique concept. This, you may remember, is called syncretism, the mixture of different ideas to create something new. Almost all ideas in history are syncretic. They're very true, completely new things, because we all take something we know and change it a little bit or add to it. And that's what syncretism is, which is a huge part of understanding history, is that syncretic mixture as people interact with each other in new ways. All right. Yeah, there's really nothing on that to do. All right, we have 2 more pages. So again, we're getting down where these are about 30 to 40 minutes because we're just hitting the high points. I'm not getting in the weeds with a lot of detail here. So you see challenges to state power. As we see empires get larger, we start seeing some conflicts, people fighting for independence, people not liking foreigners coming in and trying to tell them what to do. There are numerous examples of that. Without worrying about specific details, I think it's pretty obvious to many of us that generally we don't like being controlled by people that aren't us. We like to have independence. We like to make our own choices in life. And so we resist. And so that's especially true if it's someone who comes from a different cultural background, who doesn't speak our same language, who doesn't worship our same religion, and they've come in, they've dominated us, they've taken over. That's embarrassing. That's frustrating. And then they try to enforce their beliefs on us. Most of the most successful empires in human history have been those that have not forced their occupied peoples to follow their ideas. They give them some flexibility, and generally most of us can handle that. It's when you make us change religions or make us change this or that we're probably going to resist. And that certainly happens quite a bit. That also includes slave rebellions and resistance. The only large-scale successful slave revolt in history is going to happen in the next time period. That's in Haiti, but we see minor attempts at that, small breakouts and fights. We talked about Maroons, those escaped slaves in South America, who basically go move to the jungle and try to hide and not be recaptured. So we see establishments of those societies, which certainly do have some success here and there, but obviously slave masters are very engaged in trying to keep their slaves on their land because that's their property, and they try to make as much money as possible. So, but there are people that resist, that fight back, that challenge the system and try to be independent. All right. And then the last thing talks about changing social hierarchies, how we see people that as we get more mixtures of cultures, there's going to be different systems that are in place. There are several examples of this. Basically, in a pre-industrial era, what makes someone wealthy? What determines your wealth? Anywhere in the world, basically.
Land.
Yeah. So landowners, if you look on that page, it gives several examples. Ottoman Timars, Russian boyars, European nobility. Timar and boyar just mean noble. They're rich people that own land, and they use that land to grow crops, which they sell for profit. It's pretty simple. Now, once the Industrial Revolution happens in time period 3, all that's going to change. But for the most part, what makes someone wealthy through most of human history is land ownership, and lots of it usually. All right. So anyway, there's examples of racism, of anti-Semitism. It gives an example of how Jewish people, whenever we solidify Spain and create that nation, Jews had lived there for hundreds of years under Muslim control, had been treated well. The new Catholic rulers of Spain are not so much interested in that. So they either forcibly convert, kill, or kick out the Jews that live there. So that's that. Versus in the Islamic world at this time, it mentions the Ottoman Empire. They would accept you if you were Jew or Christian. You just had to pay slightly higher taxes than you would have if you were a Muslim. So again, acceptance, not so much in a modern sense. If we made people of certain religious faiths or lack thereof pay more taxes, that would not go over well in the 21st century, nor should it. But that was what they considered tolerance back in this time period, in the early modern era, as we call it. So looking back at time period 2, because that's really the last bullet point. When we talk, let's finish with this because we got a few minutes. And you're already up, so we might as well do something constructive, right? If I asked you to tell me, what do you think they could ask you to write a DBQ about in time period 2? What would be a large topic that might be coming your way? 1450 to 1750. Maybe if you have a copy of your 8x3 chart handy, what did you put in some of those blocks? What do you think? It's okay. Let me just finish though. What do you think might be those big picture items? Because it's not going to be something small. They're not going to ask you about different kinds of nobles in the Ottoman Empire and Russia. That ain't happening. So what do you think they might ask you to do? Megan, go ahead.
The impact of the slave trade on the modern world, or like on the world during the second time period.
Absolutely. And it could even be broader than that. It could be about different interactions as globalization increases. Slavery certainly falls into that, because globalization is just more contact with different parts of the world. That could also include the Columbian Exchange as part of that, different trade routes, more exploration. All of that could be under the umbrella of increasing globalization. And again, I think that's one of the topics, because we know that's also going to happen in time period 3, less so in time period 1, but even with the Mongols in time period 1, that's an example of globalization. So globalization and its increasing interactivity in the world is absolutely one of the topics I think could be there on the short list. All right, good. Anything else you think could show itself as a major topic of a DBQ that we learned about in time period 2?
What about the spread of empires and how they spread, like gold, God, and glory?
Sure. I mean, that's a specific example, but yes. And again, I would argue that's under the subheading of globalization, if it were. My thought is this is going to be super broad. They're not going to be nitpicky. Also, with only giving you 45 minutes, there's less to do. There's less documents to read. They also said in the webinar the other day that the documents will be shorter. So I'm expecting a paragraph or less, which means that a lot of the info is going to come from your brain. So it's got to be something so easy, so broad. The only concern I have is that some of us in a nervous situation, which this is going to be a nerve-wracking situation, you've never taken an AP exam at your house. What if your brother starts being goofy in the next room in the middle of your exam? I mean, these are things that might happen, but we have to adjust. We have to. So that means they have to adjust. They have to be more flexible. They have to lower some of their standards to give you all a fighting chance to do this well. And the good news is all of you can. I've read a competent thesis statement from everyone on this screen. Okay. If your thesis is good, then the rest of it kind of falls in line. I know all of you can do context. I've read context statements from all of you that make sense and get points. So that's 2 points right there. And I really think we're going to need 3, maybe 4 at the best to pass this exam, to get a passing score. So if we're getting thesis and context, one of the points is for using the documents, which, not that I'm saying you should do this, that's basically plot summary. Now, analysis also counts as using. So we're double dipping in a sense. But if you don't get any analysis at all, and you're just like, in document 2, it says this, blah, 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 without ever saying what that means, you would still get the use point. Not that I'm encouraging you to make that your strategy, but there's a lot of ways to get to 3 points here, people, or 4 points, if that's what it is. I'm going to go ahead and say 4 just to be on the safe side, but I really think it's going to be 3. So you don't have to know that much. You don't have to do that, so it's one of those things, just get out what you can. Let's cross that finish line. Those of you want a 5, it's going to be 7, maybe 8, but I think it's going to be more like 7. And we're going to talk more tomorrow about the details of how to do that. But I fully believe that is in the capacity of all of you. I truly, truly believe that. Because I think a lot of kids aren't going to show up. If you knew you weren't going to pass the exam and your school doesn't make you do it, why would you log in? Well, it still counts as a score. What does a 0 do to the average? Lowers it. Who does that help? All of you. Yay! So not that we want to promote the failure of others, but you're never going to know these people. It's okay. Don't worry about it. So it's going to be fine. So I truly do believe that. As I've told you all year long, if I'm worried, I'll tell you. If I think something is hard, I tell you. If I think it's easy and get on your case for not doing it, I tell you that too. And so I try to be as honest as I can be. And I think you know that. Sometimes not to your benefit, because if I get on your case, if I'm upset with you, you know I let it rip. I truly believe you guys are in an excellent position to be successful in this. And we still have 3.5 weeks to get ready. So we got plenty of time to review. And like I said, I'm also going to offer you a chance to have individual Zoom sessions with me to talk one-on-one about your essay that you're going to write next week. So that's an opportunity where anything you want, we can do, or that one piece of content, or you need a pep talk. My pep talks are, I've got some like B+ pep talks, but my A pep talks, man, woo, you want to run through a wall. So it's just, we got to save those for the day before, but we're getting to that. Now, I know this is way off topic of what I was talking about, but that's okay. What's new? Any other thoughts about what could potentially be a topic of a DBQ besides globalization?
Would westernization, would that fall along those lines?
It would, but like the increasing rise of Western powers, I think that's true. Other things I think of, because I do want to wrap this up. I don't want to keep you here just for the sake of it. But things like the just increased syncretism. So, and that could again fall under globalization, but religion. How do religions spread? Why are we doing this? What's the purpose of that? Trade specifically as a question has been a favorite for years because, as I've told you before, when you write about trade, you can write about the political organizations that are engaging in it. You can write about the economics of who's getting rich, what are they trading, why are they trading it. You can write about religion because we know religion spreading as well. We talked about Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and other faiths spreading during this time period. We can talk about culture, what other ideas are going to spread that we believe in. All those things are possible, and that gives you the widest possible berth to write about, which I think is awesome. So I think something like that is highly possible. So I was having a hard time finding DBQs that, because a lot of them, they just took old DBQs and like took out 2 documents, but they're way too specific. I found a couple, and I actually wrote one myself. And I haven't decided which one I'm going to use, but I've got 4 DBQs that I think are actually broad enough that they might look like what you're going to see, and I'm going to end up giving you 2 of them over the next month. So the one you're going to get tomorrow is really broad, and I think that's most likely what we will see, because they're just not going to ask you super specific things. It's just, there's no way they can do that. All right. Anything else? Any other questions, thoughts, ideas, anything? Yes, Grace.
I just have one question.
Of course.
Even though it's going to be extremely broad, do you think it'll still be specific to one time period?
I don't. I really think it's going to be periods 1 through 3. Now, I could be wrong, but everything that I've thought, and I've had some friends who teach this at other schools that I go back and forth with, and I'm on message boards. There's a Facebook group, there's an online discussion group, and I've been going through those the last couple of days. And the people that know things, I'm not one of them, but I pay attention to people that know things. They seem to think that's the case. There is no way, and that's been the trend anyway. When I started teaching this class 16 years ago, DBQs were super specific, LEQs were super specific, and we complained and said, look, you're having 15 and 16-year-old kids learn 10,000 years of history, which is what we did every year until this year, and then you're going to ask them one random minor question at the end of the year to determine their competency. That's completely unfair. So they started then giving us choices where you got 2 or 3 essays and you picked one, which is the case for the LEQ, and it'll be that way next year when you take an APWH. So they started listening to us. In the last couple of years, the DBQs have gotten broader. And even some of the last couple of years, we've had 2 time periods on an essay. So that's been the trend anyway, with everything going on, and the fact that a lot of people didn't finish content. A lot of people are not as fortunate as we are. The fact that I'm getting 2/3 of my students regularly participating in online review, and most of the other third are doing their work, even if they're not joining us like this. I'm very fortunate. And it doesn't have a whole lot to do with me. It's with you all being still persistent and trying to do your best and finish out strong, which I certainly appreciate. But how many kids are just done? They're like, whatever. I mean, because let's be honest, when the school system says your grade can't get worse, a lot of us are like, deuces. And I don't blame the school system. I get it. It's probably the only fair thing to do. But when they say we're out, a lot of us are like, I'm done. And I'm not saying I agree with that, but I also understand. I also know kids right now are they're having to help with their siblings and do things they normally wouldn't have to do because their parents have to work. There's a lot of chaos right now. So in my opinion, the only fair way to test you on this material is to give you as many possible ways to show your knowledge as you can, which means more time periods, broad question, and they're asking you instead of 1 piece of outside evidence in this new rubric to do 2, which means it's got to be something that anybody can write almost anything about. Because again, you guys are on the upper crust. Yes, we have open enrollment at Ballard. Anybody can take my class. There are some kids that take my class that clearly I'm not sure why they did, and that's okay. It truly is okay. But they said they wanted to, so come on in. There are a lot of there's a couple states that pay schools per AP test. So they just have kids take AP test even if they have no chance what they're doing. There are teachers every year teaching AP that haven't been trained, who don't know what this looks like. You would not believe some of the questions we get on things like the Facebook group, which for AP World has about 6,000 members nationwide and some worldwide who teach in foreign schools who take AP exams as well. And they ask questions like, so what does a thesis statement look like? And they're asking that now. I ain't the best, but I ain't the worst. Okay, so let's just be honest. We started talking about thesis statements in September, and you've written 15 of them at this point. You've had like 10 chances to come after school and sit down with me one-on-one, and we're going to have more chances online to do that in the coming weeks. So you guys are prepared. You're going to do a good job, and all you can do is your best. And I've asked you from day one, show up, try your best, I'll be satisfied. And that has not changed. Has not changed at all. If you look me in the eye and say, Mr. Rich, I did the best I could, that's all I can ask from you. And the best you could right now is probably not as good as it would have been if we were in a normal situation. So totally understand, totally get it. I'm proud of you guys for persisting. I truly am. The easiest thing to do right now would be to quit. It would be. And I can't really blame people if they do, because I don't know everybody's circumstances of what they're dealing with. So I'm thankful that you guys are trying and you're trying to do your best, and your attitudes are good and positive, and you're showing up at 9 o'clock when you still could be sleeping. And I do appreciate that. I truly, truly do. So I feel very comfortable and confident that you guys are going to be in a position to be successful. And that's all I can ask. All right. And whatever you need over the next 3.5 weeks, I'm here to help you. You just got to reach out and let me know. And my goal is to have 2 times when I can talk to you individually at least. We'll squeeze that in the week before the test as well. And if you don't need anything, then you don't need anything. And that's fine. But I just want to offer that opportunity if possible, because I'm going stir crazy and I need things to do. So, as I'm sure many of us can relate to. Mr. Rich does not sit down a lot. This is very difficult for those of us who are kind of, some of us are like, cool, this is my normal habitat. Great. God bless you. But I'm not me. I'm a goer. I'm a doer. I need things to do. So thankfully you all are providing that for me. And I appreciate that. Because it gives me some sort of purpose right now, which I definitely need. So anyway, that's not really what you asked. You did, but I had 17 tangents. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I know, Grace, it's shocking that I would go on tangents. My tangents have tangents. There was one day at AP Euro where I actually went on 3 tangents back to the original tangent and then tied all 4 of them together. And they were like, whoa. I was like, yeah, I'm the tangent king. I've been doing this for 17 years. Don't try this at home. I'm a professional. So they may get off course a little bit, but there's usually a purpose, even if it's hard to understand sometimes. Sometimes I don't even know, but that's okay. All right, I'll stop. Anything else you all need at this point? Any other questions I can answer for you? Again, we'll go more detail on DBQ and test structure tomorrow and test plan for kind of what this might look like. Got it? All right, y'all have a lovely day. Enjoy this beautiful, oh, well, put on a rain jacket, take a walk anyway. All right, I will talk to you all tomorrow, hopefully. All right, have a good day. Bye. Who's going to be last? Ethan!